All right, so let's go over the section on the nervous system. All right, so let's read part of this passage first, right? So it says the neuromuscular system. So first of all, you understand the word neuromuscular, right? So what it means is that the nervous system, right, neuro, and the muscular system, right, the muscles, they work together, right? So the neuromuscular system incorporates the nervous system and the muscular system. So the muscles, right? So this is an example of a muscle right over here. So this muscle is only going to contract and only going to work if the nervous system, like from the brain and the spinal cord, tells it to contract. So if the neuron is not sending a signal, then your muscles are just not going to contract at all. The coordination of these two systems controls and affects every part of the body in daily life functions and in the constant drive to maintain homeostasis. The function of the nervous system is to gather information from the internal and external environment and communicate any necessary changes to the muscular system. So all of this different senses, right, and they come in through the nervous system, right? These two systems function together in part due to the unique features of their cells. So this right over here, right, this is an example of a neuron. So this is like the classic cell of the nervous system. So this is kind of what it looks like, right? So it has all of these little branches. Here's the cell body right here, okay? It has all of these kind of branches coming off over here. And then usually has one very long branch called the axon that goes and connects to some other cell. So you can kind of see that this is kind of like a wire, right? So it, just like a wire sends signals, right? This neuron is designed to send signals down all these long, kind of tube-like structures. So this is the classic cell of the nervous system. Communication is accomplished by distinctive cells called neurons, like this one, this is called a neuron, that passes information using an electrical nerve impulse. Information passes through hundreds of neurons, much like the game of telephone, until it reaches the final destination of a muscle for an action to be performed. So down this axon, there's like an electrical signal that's sent, and then it connects, and that signal is sent to the next cell. So you see these things over here, right? These things are called dendrites. These ones, they're very close to the cell body. These shorter kind of attachments. So the dendrite receives information, right? So another neuron sends a signal and attaches like over here, and the signal goes down the dendrite to the cell body, and that's where it's processed. So these dendrites, all these are receiving information. Then, once that information is processed, a signal is sent down the axon to another neuron. And then maybe this neuron sends it down to another, and then to another, and to another, and so on, right? So a lot of these neurons are kind of like in a big chain and communicating from one to the next, to the next, to the next, like that. So eventually it might get to a muscle fiber or something else and cause it to do something, like cause it to contract. So if a person thinks that I want to walk, the signal gets sent down this neuron to another neuron, and eventually to a muscle, and then the muscle contracts and a person walks or lifts something up or something like that. Right? So in this lesson, right, we're going to learn about the anatomy of the nervous system, including what are the features of this neuron, and we're going to study how muscles work as well. All right, so let's talk about the different parts of the nervous system, right? So in this picture, it shows you the two main portions of the nervous system. So one portion is called the central nervous system, and the other is called the peripheral nervous system. So central means kind of like in the center, right? It means in the middle. So the brain, right, the brain and the spinal cord, these two things right here are called the central nervous system, right? It says your brain and spinal cord are the central nervous system. That's it. So these are kind of like in the center of the nervous system. And then the peripheral nervous system, peripheral means like on the outside. So all these things going all the way outside is called the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So these are the two main divisions, central and peripheral. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord, to some extent, is where information is processed. So you see all these nerves going out here, they take information in, right? Like for example, suppose you cut your hand, it sends like a pain signal to the brain, right? And then the brain also sends signals out to tell the hand to move away or to do something. So the brain, receives information and then sends information back out, right? And the peripheral nervous system, same thing, right? There's two ways here. There's you can sense something, right? So information goes back into the brain, and also once the brain decides something, then it can send information back out to the muscles or the different parts of the hand, the leg, the body to do something, right? So the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord over here, it also does some processing, right? It's not as complex as the brain, but the spinal cord does some kinds of processing. But the spinal cord, what it also does, is a connection between the brain and this peripheral nervous system, right? So the brain usually has to go through the spinal cord in order to connect to these peripheral nerves out here, right? All right. So let's look over here, right? So the peripheral nervous system has two main portions. We're going to talk about the details later, but you see the peripheral nervous system has two main portions. One is called the sensory division. So that means that this means that the sensory division receives information, right? It sends information back this way into the spinal cord in the brain, right? It senses something. Like if you sense the temperature here, information is going to go back, right? Then there's a motor division. So the motor division of these peripheral nerves sends information back out. So the brain decides, okay, lift your arm. Information is going to be sent out here to the peripheral nerves, here to your arm, and the arm is going to lift up. So these are two, there are nerves going back, sending information back, and there are nerves that carry information back out, right? So that's called the sensory division, in, and the motor division, out. So motor means moving, right? So basically that must be things going out, because the brain is sending information out. Okay, move this thing, move that thing, like that. All right, so let's look back over here, right? So you have in the peripheral nervous system, there's two main portions: the sensory division, and the motor division. All right, so there are also different portions. There are also different ways of classifying the peripheral nervous system. So it says here, the peripheral motor nerves send efferent impulses to both the somatic and autonomic divisions of the nervous system. So what does this mean? The somatic system is voluntary and controls the skeletal muscles. So you look over here, it says here the motor division, right? Things that the brain is sending out. So the somatic motor division is basically things that you control. The visceral motor division are things you don't control, right? So voluntary, meaning that you control this, and involuntary, meaning that you cannot control this, right? So somatic is like your skeletal muscles, right? That's like the biceps, triceps, leg muscles, stuff like that you can control, right? So if a person decides to go for a walk, then this is where that is, right? The muscles are being controlled by these nerves, right? That's something that a person can choose to do. The visceral motor division, this is something like controlling the heart rate, right? So the brain sends a signal out to the heart, okay, beat faster, beat slower. So that's something that person cannot control, right? So that's what this part is, the visceral motor division. Now within that, there's also two different divisions that you can't control. Like for example, the sympathetic division usually kind of speeds up the heart rate, and the parasympathetic kind of slows it down, right? So there's different things like that we're gonna talk about, right? So the somatic division, right, where the muscles are, right, that you control, that's voluntary, and it controls the skeletal muscles of the body, right? The skeletal muscles are like the regular muscles you think about that you control. Humans control this system and can decide which muscles to contract or relax at any time, right? So the autonomic system, right, is kind of like automatic, right? So autonomic sounds kind of like automatic. This is involuntary, right? And controls the visceral or cardiac muscles of organ systems, all right? So for example, down here, right, we said that there's, all of this stuff here is part of the autonomic nervous system. This is stuff that you don't control, right? That's over here. Visceral is the same as autonomic. So there's two portions, sympathetic, parasympathetic. So these control things like the heart rate, right? So the sympathetic makes the heart beat faster. Parasympathetic slows it down, right? The sympathetic dilates the pupil, makes it bigger, makes the pupil bigger. This makes the pupil, I think, smaller. So different things like that, right? So for example, you notice here, the sympathetic inhibits peristalsis and secretion, so it kind of slows down the digestive system over here. And then this one kind of speeds up the digestive system over here, like we talked about last time, right? So the sympathetic kind of slows the digestive system, and then the parasympathetic speeds it up, right? So there are different things that they do. They're kind of like opposites, right? So whatever is happening here is the opposite of what is happening over here, right? And you can see that over here, right? Sympathetic, parasympathetic, they kind of do opposite things, right? All right, so that's basically what it's talking about here, right? The things that are happening in digestion, your heart rate, those are things that you don't really control. So these things over here are kind of telling, these things are controlling those things without your control. Somatic, that's what you control. This stuff here, you don't control. All right, so this is a neuron, right? So usually this is the neuron, right? This is the cell body. These are the dendrites. They're usually pretty short. And then the axon is this big long thing over here. And it ends at what is called the axon terminals. All these small branches are axon terminals. So these end on other neurons. So this neuron sends a signal to another one, and that other one is going to send a signal to another one, to another one, to another one, and so on. So basically this neuron, right, is getting information from these dendrites, information from other neurons, and is processing and figuring out what to do. Then once it decides what to do, then it sends a signal out to the axon. Right? So the dendrites receive and the axons send out. So you have the cell body. All right? So the cell body has the nucleus, right? Like any other cell, and all the main kind of organelles, the mitochondria and all those main kinds of things. There are also some other organelles in here, but this is like the biggest area. This is like where this part has all the main organelles that we talked about before, and this part here, the axon and dendrites, those are much thinner, so they don't have as much stuff. Right. So this is a one-way street, right? So the axon is not going to send signals backwards. The signal is only going to go away through the axon, right? So you cannot send a signal back through the axon, right, to the cell body. So over here, right? Let's take a look at this picture over here. So you notice over here, right? This is the neuron right here. Okay. So this was our cell body, the dendrites, short dendrites, and then the axon sending a signal to the next neuron, right? So this junction, right, here's the axon, and this axon terminal, and the dendrite of the next neuron. This right here, right? This right here looks like this. Okay, so the signal is coming this way. Okay, the signal is coming this way, and then some chemicals are released, and the signal is sent to the next neuron. Right. So this right here, the signal is going basically this way, like this. Right. So over here, right, this small space here is called the synapse. Right. This space here between the two neurons is called the synapse. So what happens is when the signal comes down here, the electrical signal, it causes these small chemicals to be released. You see these small dots? Those are chemicals called neurotransmitters. And they're going around in these things called vesicles. They're small, tiny circles. So it goes over here, and those chemicals are released, and that the chemicals travel across the synapse to these receptors. And when these receptors, get attached to these chemicals, they cause these small channels to open, and some ions go in here, and the signal starts over again and keeps going down. Right. So the signal goes over here. Some chemicals are released. When the chemicals go and attach to the next neuron, then that sends a signal back here into the next neuron. Right. So these are called chemical neurotransmitters, right? These small chemicals in here, these are chemical neurotransmitters. So the synapse is the structure that allows neurons to pass signals on to other neurons, muscles, or glands, right? So that synapse is this space right over here. So the neurotransmitters secreted are picked up by the next cell, causing the continuation or inhibition of the impulse. So some chemicals cause signals to, some chemicals cause signals to continue. Other chemicals, other neurotransmitters do the opposite. They basically stop anything from happening down here. So some chemicals that are released here, they cause a signal to go down here into the cell body. Other chemicals that are released, right, basically stop any signals from going. Right? So sensory neurons carry afferent impulses towards the CNS, right? So let's look over here, right? So this right here is the spinal cord. This is basically like a cross section through the spinal cord, right? So let's say this is the skin, and let's say this is the muscle. So the skin receives some kind of signal, right? Maybe temperature, touch, something like that. So then a signal is sent back to the spinal cord, right? Back to the central nervous system. So this nerve that's sending things back, this is called afferent nerve. Okay, and then when the spinal cord is sending a signal back out to the muscle to move or do something, that's called efferent nerve. So afferent brings signals back. Efferent sends signals away. All right. So spinal nerves are bundles of nerve fibers, axons and dendrites, and therefore contain both afferent and efferent impulses. So you see the spinal cord, right? There are nerves coming off the spinal cord. So the nerves are usually not just like one neuron. They're usually a collection of all these different neurons put together, right? So when you see like a nerve coming off the spinal cord, it probably has a bunch of these efferent neurons coming out and a lot of these afferent nerves going in. So these are kind of bunched together into what are called spinal nerves. All right, so suppose a signal is sent to a muscle, right? So here's like a muscle fiber right over here, right? So this muscle fiber over here has even smaller sort of fiber-like things called myofibrils, right? So this right here is like one myofibril right over here. And then if we zoom into this myofibril, okay, even more, it's going to look something like this, right? So it says muscles are fibrous tissue with the unique ability to shorten or contract, to move body parts, and then to relax back to the original length, right? So the muscle contracts and move things towards each other, and then when it relaxes, things move back, right? So that's how it causes things to move. So each of these, right? So it says here, a muscle like the bicep consists of bundles of muscle fibers or cells. And then each of these muscle fibers contains a lot of these myofibrils, right? Now, within this, there are basically two main kinds of proteins, right? Each of these myofibrils has two main kinds of proteins that causes, the muscles to contract, that actually does the work. So you see here in the blue, right? You see the blue? That's one kind of protein, okay? And then in the red, that's another kind of protein. So these are called actin and myosin, right? So actin and myosin are the blue and the red, right? So we're going to, myosin and actin, these are the two main kinds of proteins that make up muscles and actually contract and do the work that causes muscles to move. So the blue and the red, these are actin and myosin. So let's go to the next one. So let's take a look at this over here, right? So again, this is actin and myosin. All right. So you see in the red, right? So I think in this one they flip the colors, right? So you see in the middle, you see the red, that's the myosin. And then you see the blue, thinner ones, that's actin, right? So the thicker ones are myosin and the thinner ones are actin. So right here, right, you can see here that, look at the length of the overall muscle, this part of the muscle right over here, right? So from here to here, right? This is, this length here is in the relaxed phase, right? Relaxed phase. Now, when they contract together, you see it's a little bit shorter here. So that's how it causes things to move, right? So something is attached to this end, and when it contracts, it's kind of pulled something in, right? So the muscles in the relaxed phase look like this. But when you like contract your bicep, for example, you notice the bicep gets shorter. So that's when the muscle, the muscle fibers are looking like this. So the myosin and actin, they kind of pull against each other from the relaxed phase to the contracted phase, right? All these things are pulling against each other and cause it to become smaller, and that's how the muscle contracts, right? So this only happens when a signal arrives from a neuron, right, from the nervous system. So it says here, when the axon terminal secretes the chemical neurotransmitter at the synapse of a neuromuscular junction, it causes the muscle to contract. So it requires one of those neurons to secrete one of those neurotransmitter chemicals to cause all of this to happen. Otherwise, the muscle doesn't do anything, right? So this is relaxation, and this is contraction, right? So you can see that the proteins themselves, they actually don't become smaller, right? It's not like the blue became smaller from here to here. It's just that the blue moved closer together, right? These two blue things moved closer together, right, to contract. So how does this happen? Well, it uses ATP to happen, right? So, this is the myosin. You see this right here? This is the myosin right here, and this is the actin. So when ATP is used, it causes these small heads on the myosin proteins to kind of contract and move and kind of pull. You can see it kind of looks like a kind of like an oar on a boat kind of moving, right? So this looks like a kind of oar on a boat. So it kind of attaches here and kind of pulls it, right? Kind of attaches here and kind of pulls it. It kind of pulls it this way, just like an oar pulls a boat forward in the water. So this happens because ATP is used as energy. So it says here the ATP, the chemical energy of all cells, is used to cause the contraction and is also necessary for the relaxation of the muscle. So this whole process requires ATP for this to happen. So many muscle fibers must contract in a unified pattern to cause a fluid muscle contraction. So it's not just like one small portion like this contracts. Usually when a muscle contracts, all of these in the muscle contracts. So if each one contracts a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, it all kind of adds up, and the whole muscle moving, moves something, a much larger distance. Each neuron supplies signals to several, up to hundreds of muscle fibers, right? So that's important because, so in some places, right, you want you have big muscles where you want, all, so each of these is called a sarcomere. So you want all of these sarcomeres to all contract together. So you don't want to send separate neurons to like a big muscle, like the bicep muscle, because otherwise different parts are going to contract at different amounts at different times, right? So one neuron can, cause a large area to contract in a big muscle like the biceps. But in some places, right, like when you have like small eye muscles, hand muscles, right, you don't, in the eye, you don't have huge muscles that you need to contract. In the hand, right, you might have some muscles, but you want to individual fine motor control, right? Because in the hand you want things, when a person is writing, for example, right, you want very careful control over the hand. So each neuron in the hand doesn't sort of innervate and go into like a huge area of muscle, right? Each neuron just goes to a small area. That way you can control, right, the muscles in your hand much more closely and finely. But in the biceps or the triceps, stuff like that, bigger muscles, then you don't have as much fine control, right? All right. So the autonomics division, right, sort of the automatic stuff that you don't control, controls the contraction and relaxation of visceral reflexes, right? So these are things that you don't control. These are in the organs and the heart, stuff like that. So neurons go to those muscles as well, to the cardiac muscle, to the smooth muscle, all right? But those are things you don't control. Now, in the skeletal muscle, you do control it. All right, and I think this is just talking about the same thing we talked about before, the heart rate, stuff like that. All right, so let's look at some disorders of the neuromuscular system. All right, so the neuromuscular system, of course, is composed of both the nervous and muscle systems. So if you have a problem in either one, you could have a problem. So sometimes, right, they talk about a muscle strain, right? So you can have ligaments, tendons, and the muscles. All of those can stretch and kind of tear a little bit. So in the strained muscle tissue, there just can be like a lot of tiny tears in the muscle. Or let's suppose you stretch a ligament, just some tiny tears in the ligaments and the tendons, different things like that, right? So inside the muscle fibers, there's just going to be some tiny tears, right? So in this case, right, there's no problem with the nervous system. This is just a problem of the muscles, right? Now, in some nervous system disorders, right, like let's say this thing called ALS, right? In ALS, right, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. In this disease, right, the motor neurons degenerate and die. So remember that the motor neurons are the things that cause the muscles to move. So if this motor neuron starts to die off, well, then the muscle it's attached to is also going to die off because you can't really move it much, right? So a person, right, if a healthy person here can move this muscle a lot because their neurons are working well, then this muscle is going to stay healthy and strong, right? Like if a person does a lot of weightlifting, this muscle is going to become stronger. But if this person here, their neurons die off and they can't control this muscle is also just going to die off and become smaller and shrink, right? So this is called ALS. So a problem in the nervous system results in a problem in the muscles, right? So even though there might be nothing wrong with the muscles themselves, because there's a problem with the nervous system, the muscles also start to die off because they're not able to be worked, right? Now there's something else called muscular dystrophy. Right? So in muscular dystrophy, look at this picture here. In a muscular dystrophy, there is a problem with the muscle itself. So the different proteins in the muscle, they're not made correctly. So, a person here is also going to be very weak. Right? It's going to be difficult for them to move their muscles, and so the muscle is going to just remain weak, unlike a normal person who can work their muscles. Right? So it says here in ALS, right? So in ALS, right, these are going to be muscles that you can control, right? Because these are motor neurons. This is something that you control. So only the muscles that you control die off, but the other muscles may not die off, right? They may work properly. But in muscular dystrophy, right, both voluntary and involuntary muscles are compromised, right? Because in ALS, right, the other muscles that you don't consciously control yourself, they're just going automatically on their own, right? So there's no problem with them. In muscular dystrophy, it's a problem in the muscle itself. So it's not a problem in the neuron, it's a problem in the muscle itself. So even those muscles that you don't control, they're also going to start to die off. So in muscular dystrophy, both the voluntary, right, the things you control, and involuntary, right, the muscles you don't control are compromised. And it talks about other things, right? Let's suppose you have a spinal cord injury, right? In the spinal cord in the back, right? In the back, there's a spinal cord going inside the bones. Suppose there's a spinal cord injury. Well, all the signals from the brain cannot go down to the muscles, and so the muscles will again start to die off because you can't control them. So if you're not working the muscles are going to get weaker and weaker, and you can't move them.